I can demolish a 600-page fantasy novel in about 5 days. Last month, it was the entire Fourth Wing series, 3 books, about 800 pages each. I read them in 2 weeks, staying up till 2 a.m., completely unable to put them down. But I cannot finish a 3,000-word investigative piece. Even when it's about true crime, and I love true crime. Even when it's about something I theoretically should care about. This contradiction has haunted me all semester. I'm 22 years old. I'm a journalism student who doesn't read journalism. So, I spent the last 4 months trying to figure out why. I interviewed legendary long-form writers, people who have spent decades figuring out how to keep the readers hooked for 8,000 words. I needed to know, what are they doing that makes people care? And what I discovered wasn't exactly what I expected. The standard narrative is familiar. Gen Z has the attention span of a goldfish. TikTok has destroyed our brains. We want bite-sized content, quick dopamine hits, and we can't focus on anything longer than a tweet. Long-form journalism is dying because readers like me are broken. Except I'm not broken. I'm not short on attention. I'm short on something else. A reason to care. When I started this capstone in August, I gathered the usual suspects. Algorithm-driven feeds, mobile-first reading, the economic collapse of newsrooms, but mostly I wanted to understand why I felt like a traitor, a journalism student who loved reading but couldn't force herself to read journalism. So I reached out to people who have mastered this craft. Skip Hollandsworth has been at Texas Monthly for 36 years, writing crime stories that have become movies. Jerry Mitchell leads the investigative team at Mississippi Today, known for his work on civil rights cold cases. Ross McCammon is the editor-in-chief of Texas Monthly, who spent 2 decades at the most prestigious magazines in New York. And Roxana Asgharian is a freelance investigative journalist who writes about the criminal justice system and child welfare. I expected them to tell me long-form was dying, but instead, they told me something far more interesting. Skip Hollandsworth grew up in Wichita Falls, Texas, the white-bread son of a preacher, piano lessons, Boy Scouts, the local country club pool, and then one day everything changed.
I grew up in Wichita Falls. I was a white-bread kid, Boy Scout, took piano lessons, played the cello in the school orchestra, volunteered at the state hospital for the mentally ill, and was the son of a preacher, minister, pastor. So I had no real dark side that I knew about until one day there was this murder that took place in Wichita Falls, where an oilman was found murdered in his bed, and his wife was found shot to death in her bed. And they had this big estate and highly protected with guard dogs. So rumors were going wild as to why they got shot. And then it turns out that the medical examiner report showed that the wife shot him, and then she climbed into bed and shot herself. And for reasons I'll never be able to explain, I became a little fixated on this whole subject of people crossing this invisible line and doing things, who lived innocent lives, but who did things so unexpected and so flabbergasting that you couldn't look away.
Skip was 16. He'd never known anyone who'd been arrested.
I would swim in the local pool, the local country club pool, past the ladies who were talking, and I would slow down to see if maybe I could hear what they were talking about. And I had someone drive it, because I did have my driver's license. I had someone drive me up to the mansion where the dead couple had lived, and my heart was pounding.
40 years later, and Skip still carries this obsession. He's written hundreds of stories for Texas Monthly, stories about people who appear ordinary but do things so unexpected you can't look away. But there's something he told me that stuck more than any of his stories.
I've been at Texas Monthly for 36 years, other magazines before that, other newspapers before that, and I still don't know how to do it. It's hard. You just have to understand writing is hard. And writing nonfiction, can be the hardest kind of writing of all.
Then he said the thing that separates good writing from the bad.
You got to figure out a way to keep that phone from getting in your reader's hands. And you've got to figure out a way to keep the reader hurtling toward the next paragraph.
Hurtling towards the next paragraph. I understood that intellectually, but I didn't feel it until I thought about my fantasy books. Every single page of every book I've loved was structured exactly like this. Short chapters that ended on cliffhangers, information doled out strategically, tension built deliberately. The writer's entire job was to make me need to turn the page. Most journalism doesn't necessarily do this. Most journalism assumes that being informative is enough. It treats readers like we owe it our attention because the topic is important. But Skip knows something most journalists have forgotten. We don't owe anything. You have to earn it.
We still write long form, but any long form editor will tell you there's this enormous emphasis on writing, on structure, on style, because the reader has got 1 trillion other ways to spend that 5 to 15 minutes of their life, and they need to feel a payoff for giving that time over to you as the writer.
That was Chris Tomlinson, a columnist for the Houston Chronicle and the author of best-selling books Tomlinson Hill and Forgetting the Alamo. He spent more than 30 years as a journalist, from covering war zones in Africa and the Middle East to writing about the intersection of money and politics back home in Texas. He's one of the state's sharpest voices on why storytelling and earning the reader's attention matters now more than ever.
I think because we're competing for people's attention, we hear a lot about the attention economy. And journalism is part of the attention economy. We're competing for people's attention. And we have to, not only get their attention, but we have to somehow convince them to pay us for their attention. I call it the what the fuck factor. If it is a story that just makes me go, what the fuck, how did this ever happen?
Mm-hmm.
This is unbelievable. That's the story that you can do long form. And as you mentioned earlier, a narrative arc is critical. Having a protagonist and an antagonist. This is the old new journalism movement of the 60s of how do we take these true stories and apply literary techniques to make them more compelling and more enjoyable to read, more entertaining. And I think we fool ourselves as journalists when we're not honest about entertaining people.
Hooking readers is just the beginning. The harder question is, how do you keep them reading? Jerry Mitchell discovered the answer in grad school at Ohio State.
And I had a class, it was called literary journalism. And I took that class, and that was really the first time that I was reading, nonfiction, and I was like, oh, wow, this nonfiction is written so well, and I'm like, I want to do some of this. Like, it inspired me. I wanted to do it.
In that class, Jerry learned something called the uninterrupted dream, John Gardner's concept of keeping readers so entranced in a narrative that they don't notice the real world around them.
You want to keep people connected into that narrative, that dream, that it's kind of playing, it's like a movie playing out in people's heads.
This is exactly how I feel when I'm reading those 600-page novels. I'm inside someone else's consciousness, living their story so completely that reality fades. Time dissolves and my phone could blow up and I probably wouldn't even notice. Jerry put this into practice when he started writing serialized narratives for the Clarion Ledger, stories broken into chapters that ran for days.
I did another one later on which was about the disease that runs in my family, rare genetic disease that runs in my family. It was called Genetic Disaster, which is what a doctor called my family. And yeah, really did.
Yeah,
And
exactly what you want to hear from a doctor.
yeah, exactly what you want to hear from the doctor. So my grandfather died of it. All his siblings died of it. My aunt died of it. My dad thought he had it. Anyway, it's just, so the story ended with me finding out I didn't have it. And that was kind of the end of that, narrative. But I'm always reminded of the power of narrative as opposed to just like a news story, or there's something about a narrative that just has an inherent power that just regular. And so, I had someone tell me that she was out there waiting for her paper to hit the driveway at 5:30 or 6 in the morning or whatever it was, waiting on the carrier to deliver the paper to find out if I had the disease or not.
Now just let that sink in. A woman rearranged her morning routine, woke up at 5:30 a.m. to find out if Jerry Mitchell, a journalist she'd never met, had the genetic disease that ran in his family. She wasn't forced to care, but the story made her care so much that she couldn't wait. And that's the power of structure. But here's what Jerry also noticed. Structure doesn't really work if you interrupt it.
But if you have all this kind of side stuff, I always worry, this is gonna they're gonna go down this rabbit hole, and we all do this. YouTube pops up, and you go, let me go check this YouTube out, and the next thing you know, you've been on there 2 hours. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so I just kind of fear that the narrative gets lost, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Jerry's solution: end every chapter on tension.
You want to keep the reader reading. And so you want, again, I don't know why I think of it this way abstractly, but it's almost like a musical scale. You instead of ending on like a finishing note where you would, like the end of a piece, you go, okay, that's the ending. You end in such a way that it creates tension or drama or a setback or whatever it is. So people are going, wait a minute. And you have to keep reading to know what happens.
He gave me a perfect example. When he wrote about James Meredith, a civil rights activist who was shot during his march through Mississippi, Jerry embedded the AP's initial mistaken report that Meredith had died. Readers wouldn't know until later that he'd actually survived.
And so I found out in my research that AP had actually initially reported James Meredith was dead. So I used that, like that AP reported that he was dead, and left it there, and then went from there to now I'm switching back to the Klansman. So you have this little break. So you don't know necessarily, unless you realize James Meredith, or even if you knew James Meredith was still alive, you'd still be going, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense, but you're going to keep reading.
That's a technique that predates the internet by centuries, but journalism has mostly abandoned it in favor of the inverted pyramid. Put the most important information first and then trail off. I've read both structures. The inverted pyramid puts me to sleep. The narrative arc that ends on tension makes me physically unable to stop. But there's a reason most journalism doesn't do this anymore, and it has nothing to do with the readers. Roxana Asgharian has been a freelance journalist for 15 years. She writes about the criminal justice system and child welfare, topics that should make people pretty angry, topics that matter. When I asked her about the economics of freelance writing, her answer was brutal.
The last story I had come out in December of last year was 6,000 words, and I got $6,000 for it, but I worked on it for like a year and a half.
I'll do the math for you. That's $4 an hour. $4 an hour for a deeply reported investigative journalism piece. But Roxana doesn't dwell on the money, though she probably should. Instead, she talked about why she spends 18 months reporting.
The bar is just getting higher for long form.
Yeah.
Like if you want to have a 3,000, 5,000, 8,000 word story, you better have like just a banger. You know what I mean?
And when I heard that, I understood why I don't read most journalism articles. Most articles aren't bangers. They're competent, well-researched, accurate, but they don't make me feel like anything except a vague sense of obligation to read. My fantasy books, those are bangers. They create characters I love or love to hate. They build worlds I want to inhabit. Roxana knows that real journalism can do this too. She spends those 18 months finding the human details that transforms an abstract problem into something visceral. This isn't just a freelancer problem. The whole industry is struggling. Don Van Natta spent 16 years at the New York Times, won 3 Pulitzer Prizes, and now works at ESPN. He's watched the collapse firsthand.
Far less of it now than when I started my journalism career in the late 1980s. There were many more newspapers back then with budgets that were big enough that they would invest in long-form journalism, investigative journalism, enterprise journalism. There's far fewer newspapers. The newspapers like the Miami Herald that used to have a circulation on Sunday of 700,000 or 800,000 now have circulations of 20,000, and they have shrunken budgets, and they don't have the money, they don't have the resources, they don't have the people to do the kind of long form journalism that used to be done routinely around the country. But despite that, there's still all sorts of other new outlets, digital only outlets that are still continuing the long form journalism tradition. There's less of it, but there's still quite a bit of it, and which is great. I mean, there's certainly a need for it.
The audience didn't disappear. The business model did. And when the business model collapsed, newsrooms made a choice. Cut staff, hire freelancers, chase clicks instead of craft. The bar for good enough disappeared. Now it's either banger or nothing. Mark Horvath is a journalism professor at the University of Missouri. But before the classroom, he spent 2 decades as an investigative editor and reporter in Texas newsrooms and ran Investigative Reporters and Editors, the top training organization for investigative journalists in the country. His perspective bridges the classic craft of investigative reporting with the evolving toolkit every reporter now needs. When I asked Mark if the definition of long form had changed, he didn't hesitate.
I wouldn't define it differently. I mean, to me, long form journalism is just, a story that you've taken some time to report and that is going to take some time for the audience to consume, right? So the difference is the multi-platform nature of it. When I started doing this, after graduating from college, it was all you thought about was writing and then having some photos, right? That was it. And that's still plenty. But and by the way, that's true. It's still oftentimes that's plenty, right? That's often the case. Though now you might also have a mini documentary or some kind of video to go with it. Now we try to have interactive graphics if we've got data, so that the audience can interact with it. Now we also often think about audio, right? And these just weren't things that I was thinking about back when I graduated. But the idea, that's all I do with my students here at the university, pretty much. I do have some daily. I won't bore you with it, but I do have some reporters who do daily stuff too. But for my classes, it's all long form, and I don't change what I teach, at all. The way the stories get presented can be, but isn't always what's different. The truth is, when we used to write 3,000 word stories, still most people didn't read them. I mean, we knew that. People say people have short attention spans now. That's probably true, but it's always been true. It may be truer, but it's always been true. And we never kidded ourselves to think that when I wrote some big, huge opus, everybody was going to read it. They weren't. Some people would start it. Some people would get a ways into it. Fewer people would finish it. But the idea was always that was okay. That the long form stuff was for a portion of the audience that wanted it, and based on topic and style of story, that audience could change and grow and shrink. But it was always a small minority of the overall audience for any news organization. I think people forget that that's always been true.
He pushed back against the whole "nobody reads long stories anymore" trope, reminding me that attention has always been precious and audiences have always been choosy.
One thing though, so when I was in my previous job at IRE, that nonprofit, we We started while I was there. We did a lot of training for broadcast journalists, and we changed the nature of the way we were training for investigative for that. We started doing what we called quick hit investigative training because the stations weren't going to be airing a whole lot of big, long projects. Again, really never did, but especially as newsrooms got tighter and money got tighter. So we started doing more training in what we called quick hit investigations, which is sort of like what we do a lot of in text, what we call rolling investigations, which is instead of trying to gather for months and then spew out the big project, it's getting some and going with it, getting some more and going with it, getting some more and going with it. That's always been a really effective way to do. You might not consider that long form because none of the stories might be really, really long, but the body of work that's created by it ends up being long, right?
Mhm.
And it's a way to get more readers or more listeners or more viewers, and it's a way to continually have hits. So you're on the air more times with it. It can have more impact. It gets more attention.
Mark's students build projects in every format imaginable. He insists the platform is flexible, but core skills aren't.
Because reporting is reporting is reporting. How you present it is the thing that's changed,
Mhm.
right? And everybody is also presenting on the web now. It doesn't matter if you're reporting for a television station or if you're reporting for an NPR affiliate, you still have to have a web presence.
For young journalists, his message is simple. Master the basics, think creatively, and remember that storytelling devices that work in fiction, character, color, scene, are exactly what deep journalism needs most right now. But here's the thing. Some outlets figured it out. They're not choosing between platforms, they're mastering all of them. Ross McCammon spent 2 decades working at the most prestigious magazines in New York. Esquire, GQ, Women's Health. He watched the industry transform from print first to digital first, from a few 100,000 readers to millions chasing clicks. When he came back to Texas to become the editor-in-chief of Texas Monthly, he brought a different philosophy.
We're just gonna stick with it. We believe that good stories get read. The issue for me is not that the audiences are not ready to engage with something long and in depth. The issue is that just we haven't been doing a very good job as an industry of maintaining that tradition and training people who know how to do it.
He wasn't defending the old ways. Texas Monthly isn't just a magazine anymore. It's a full media operation.
We do podcasts, as many as 4 a year, and they're usually narrative podcasts, which are a lot more expensive to make. But a lot of those come off of, it's just a different way of telling our stories. We did a story about missing Vietnam airmen missing for 50 something years, called The Final Flight of Captain Forrester. That was a feature. That was a 13,000 word feature in our print magazine and of course online, which got loads of readership, but it also was a 5-episode podcast that we did an original score for. We literally have somebody employed at Texas Monthly who scores our audio podcasts and our video. It's remarkable. It's incredible. But that's a whole different way of telling that story.
One story, 3 formats, same depth, different delivery. But here's what Ross said that most people miss.
My concern is not about audiences. I've never been concerned about audiences. I believe look, I love TikTok, right? I use TikTok. I'll go home and I'll just do 30 minutes on TikTok as a way to unwind. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I also have about 7 big fat novels on my nightstand, and I'm not ignoring them. I'm making a decision about reading one over the other. And I think that's what people do.
This shifted something in my understanding. The problem isn't that I can't choose long form. The problem is that most long form isn't compelling enough to win that choice.
You can look at every paragraph of a 13,000 word narrative story as a fight for someone's attention. That's the same as it was in 1955. It's the same as it is in 2025. You have to give people a reason to read this stuff. You have to get them. You have to propel them into the story. And then your job as a narrative storyteller is to maintain that interest, because people will bail. They will bail so fast. And that's not anything, that's not new. That's not new. So my job is to make sure that we're giving people a reason on the sentence level to stick with a story, and they will. They will. Just as you I mean, that there's just as much dopamine involved in that decision than there is on like what reels you're looking at.
On the sentence level, not the topic level, not the this is important level, the sentence level. What struck me most wasn't the technique or the platforms or the economics. It was how personal this was for all of them. Skip, after 36 years and hundreds of published stories, still struggles.
When I was younger, I would write these long sentences, right? And I like to show off on my writing. You know, that's part of the fun of writing, is you get to show your chops. Now, when I go back, I think a book of mine is coming out on some of my crime articles that I've written over the years about women criminals in Texas. I've reread these articles that some came out 10 years ago, and I'll find myself cutting it. Big, sentences really pared down. No fat. You know, you get moving, and I know the reason. It's because I get bored with my own stories. Instead of, holding it up in the air and go, look what I've done, I start getting bored.
He gets bored after 4 decades of mastering this craft. If he doesn't believe every sentence deserves to be there, why should we expect readers to? Jerry's advice was simpler, but no less profound.
Read good writing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is the thing I came to learn in grad school. I wasn't taught it per se, but life is too short to read bad books. It's the idea of, it's like a diet. I don't mean diet as in people dieting to lose weight. I mean a diet as in what you eat every day.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your reading diet? Like, one of my favorites is Joan Didion, but it's called Some Dreamers of the Golden Dream. You want to read the very best nonfiction writers. I'm a fan of Eric Larson. The best one, in my opinion, still is Devil in the White City. Your best teachers are going to be great writers. And read from them. You have a steady diet of great writers.
They all understood something crucial. Caring comes from specificity, not abstraction. You can tell people about systematic injustice all day and they'll scroll past. But give them one person, one mother separated from her child, one wrongly convicted man counting the days. And suddenly, it's unbearable. That's what my novels do. That's what the best journalism does. And that's what most journalism has forgotten how to do. It was mid-September when everything changed. Ross had insisted I read a story Skip wrote years ago, a piece called Still Life about a high school football player named John McClamrock who was paralyzed during a violent tackle 35 years ago in Dallas. 13,000 words. I'd seen it cited in sources a dozen times, and I kept telling myself I'd get to it. One Wednesday night, I finally opened it on my laptop. Just the first page, I thought. I'll read the lead and see if it hooks me. But I didn't stop. I don't even know what time I finished. I know I forgot my phone was a thing. I know I forgot I had homework due. I know I got to the last word and felt that specific ache of closure. The one I usually only felt at the end of a novel, when a world closes and you're ready to return to reality. Skip didn't open Still Life by telling me about a football tackle. He opened it with John's mother. He opened it with presence and specificity. He made me see this woman, understand her before anything else. By the time the tragedy happened, I was already invested. I already cared about these people. The tragedy became unbearable not because I read about it, but because I knew John and his mother as complete human beings. And that's what Skip does. He creates characters so fully realized you can't look away. Skip had done exactly what my favorite novels do. He created a character I couldn't look away from. He'd structured the story so that every paragraph led to the next. He'd embedded himself in John and his mother's consciousness until I forgot I was reading journalism. It felt like a story. It felt like something real that mattered. That's when I understood. This isn't about length. It isn't about attention spans. It's about craft. Over the course of this semester, I learned 4 lessons. From Skip, the hook that won't let go. You have to keep readers hurtling towards the next paragraph. One clunker sentence, and then they're gone.
That's because if you write a clunker of a sentence, they're going to start glancing above the print book or however you're reading your nonfiction book, and they will move on. And I know that's true because I do it all the time.
From Jerry, structure that builds tension. End every chapter on a note that propels readers forward. Create that uninterrupted dream.
You end in such a way that it creates tension or drama or a setback or whatever it is. So people go like, wait a minute, and you have to keep reading to know what happens.
From Roxana, stakes that require depth. The work has to be a banger. There's no room for merely good anymore.
Like, it has to be like, wow, I'm just obsessed and I can't stop reading. And that's a high bar to meet.
From Ross and Dawn, platforms that multiply reach. Adapt a story to every medium, but never sacrifice quality for distribution.
Maybe it becomes a video story, right? So that's difficult sometimes, right? To go, okay, yeah, let's do this. Let's do it this way. So we're not just saying yes to the story. We're saying yes, but let's do it like this. Let's do it for this platform.
Started out as just a print guy. I was a newspaper reporter. I did no audio. I did no video. It wasn't until I was mid-career that I branched out and learned how to do podcasts, audio, television Q&As, docuseries, all sorts of other platforms now that I've had to learn to do, because if you want to survive as a journalist, if you want to thrive as a journalist, you want to be a multi-platform journalist that can do storytelling in all sorts of different ways.
Here's what I realized. My generation doesn't have an attention problem. We have a caring problem. And the journalism industry created that problem by choosing speed over depth, clicks over craft, information over emotion. I can still sit for 6 hours reading about fictional characters. I can binge an entire podcast series in 2 days. I can watch a YouTube video about an obscure topic I didn't even know existed an hour earlier. My attention is not broken. It's just that most journalism isn't making the choice worth my while. But when journalism does do the work, when it creates characters instead of sources, when it structures for narrative tension instead of information density, when it embeds specificity instead of abstractions, I read it like I read novels. I'd read it twice. I'd call the writer, ask how they did it. The real crisis isn't that readers can't focus. It's that publishers stop demanding that writers make us focus. Somewhere along the way, the industry decided that being informative was enough, that the public would read important news out of obligation, that we didn't need to earn attention. We could just demand it. That was the lie. I came into this project as a 21-year-old who could devour fantasy novels but couldn't finish think pieces. I'm leaving it, now 22 years old, but one who's just finished reading Still Life for the second time, who's already deep into another Jerry Mitchell work, who's waiting impatiently for the next one. I was broken not by my attention span, but by journalism that didn't think I was worth trying for. Now that I've experienced what it feels like when journalism does try, when it applies the same narrative craft, the same character development, the same structural tension that keeps me reading fiction at 2 a.m., I can't unsee it. I can't go back to thinking this is about TikTok or dopamine or my generation's inability to focus. The choice now is whether the industry will do the same. As I move forward into this field, I'm going to write stories that compete not with other media, but with novels people can't put down. I'm going to spend the time. I'm going to embed the specificity. I'm going to make sure every paragraph earns the next one. Because I've lived on both sides of this equation. As the reader who couldn't care, and as the reader who suddenly couldn't stop reading. And I know which version of journalism is worth fighting for. If I can read 600 pages about fictional characters in 5 days, You can absolutely make me read 6,000 words about something real. You just have to make me give a damn. And I know you can. This has been The Caring Problem: Why a 22-year-old Stopped Reading Journalism. Special thanks to Skip Hollinsworth of Texas Monthly, Jerry Mitchell of Mississippi Today, Ross McCammon, editor-in-chief at Texas Monthly, Chris Tomlinson, a columnist at the Houston Chronicle, Don Van Natta, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist with ESPN, Roxana Asgharian, an investigative journalist, and everyone else who I spoke to for this project. This podcast was produced as a part of my senior capstone project at Texas Christian University under the guidance of Dr. John Tisdale. If you want to read the written version of the story, visit the link in the description and follow me on Instagram at SydsShoots, SYDSSHOOTS. I'm Sydney Jansen. Thanks for listening.